Welcome back to Mama Mystery. I am interrupting our normal schedule to bring you breaking news, which is that Bryan Kohberger is rumored to be accepting a plea deal right before his trial is set to begin for the murders of the 4 Idaho college students, Xana Kernodle, Kaylee Goncalves, Ethan Chapin, and Maddie Mogen. Multiple credible reports are indicating that Bryan Kohberger has agreed to plead guilty to the murders of those 4 students as part of a deal to avoid the death penalty. So in this proposed agreement, Bryan would plead guilty to all 4 first-degree murder charges, and prosecutors would drop the death penalty from consideration. So this means Bryan could receive a sentence of life in prison, reportedly 4 consecutive life terms, instead of facing a potential execution. So a change of plea hearing was set for Wednesday, which is tomorrow, July 2nd, to formally record Bryan's new guilty pleas in court. So this is, of course, a departure from his earlier not guilty plea and comes just weeks before his trial was originally slated to begin in August. The primary motive for Kohberger to consider a plea deal is to avoid a death sentence, and his defense team had already tried unsuccessfully to get the death penalty removed from the case through pretrial motions, at one point arguing that Bryan's autism diagnosis should bar a capital prosecution. Now, with prosecutors resolute about seeking the death penalty at trial, a negotiated plea deal to life imprisonment would guarantee that Bryan Kohberger is spared execution, eliminating the risk of a death verdict by a jury. Entering a plea deal could also be a strategic acknowledgement of the substantial evidence that is against him. So investigators have publicly linked Bryan to the crime through DNA and other evidence. For example, we all already know, and it's been broadcast in all the 48 hours, the 2020s, the datelines, we all know his DNA was reportedly found on a knife sheath at the murder scene, tying him directly to the killings. But additionally, just last week, a judge denied the defense's attempt to delay the trial further and also rejected a bid to propose an alternate suspect, leaving Bryan Kohberger with very few strong avenues for reasonable doubt at trial. So, of course, with the trial looming, pleading guilty may be seen by his attorneys as the least risky option given the evidence and the pretrial rulings. It does seem like he was kind of up against this wall, like the judge is saying, no more delays. The trial is going to start on this date, and if you're not ready, that's too bad, essentially. And, with all this evidence against him, I think he finally gave it up and was like, okay, I don't think I'm going to be able to win this. And finally, agreed to plead guilty, which he should have done in the beginning. But by accepting a plea deal, of course, he is also avoiding a lengthy, high-profile trial, and then, of course, the years of appeals that typically follow a death sentence. So when I first heard about this, I thought, this would be good for the families, that maybe this would be some relief for the families. But actually, it has come out that they are very upset, and I will talk about that in a second also. But prosecutors, in a letter to the victims' families, apparently pointed out that this resolution ensures that Bryan will spend the rest of his life in prison. He is waiving any rights to any appeals. He will be in prison without any chance of ever getting out. The guy is gonna die in prison. So, this kind of guarantees a faster and more certain outcome, whereas if he was found guilty and sentenced to death, there are so many appeals that this would be such a lengthy process, and I feel like it would just be constantly ripping open that wound every time he goes up for some appeal. So that's the way that I saw it. However, at least one victim's family has publicly decried the rumored plea agreement as a shock and a betrayal. So the parents of Kaylee, one of the 4 students that were killed, said that the plea deal was very unexpected and expressed anger toward authorities for agreeing to it. They said, quote, "We are beyond furious at the state of Idaho." They actually wrote a post about this on Facebook through their page, which is called the Goncalves family page. And so I'm going to read that for you now. It says, "The death penalty is merely an illusion in the criminal justice system. When available, it serves as a bargaining tool for the state, and when rarely applied, it's never enforced due to a highly inefficient appellate process. The notion that someone can plead guilty to a crime and still face years of appellate delays reveals a systemic failure. The Latah County Prosecutor's Office's treatment of our family during this process is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. We questioned decisions early in the investigation, like why was the mayor commenting on the case? Why was the coroner speaking to the families? Why was an officer with less than 2 years experience leading the investigation? Why was the University of Idaho involved when they declared it an isolated off-campus incident? Why was the university permitted to write a book about the incident while others were silenced under an overly broad order? As a result, we were branded adversaries, so it was no shock how the Latah County Prosecutor's Office mishandled the plea deal. They vaguely mentioned a possible plea on Friday without seeking our input and presented the plea on Sunday. Latah County should be ashamed of its prosecutor's office. 4 wonderful young people lost their lives, yet the victims' families were treated as opponents from the outset. We weren't even called about the plea. We received an email with a letter attached. That's how Latah County's prosecutor's office treats murder victims' families. Adding insult to injury, they're rushing the plea, giving families just 1 day to coordinate and appear at the courthouse for a plea on July 2nd. Who do they think they are? After more than 2 years, this is how it concludes, with a secretive deal and a hurried effort to close the case without any input from the victims' families on the plea's details. Our family is frustrated right now, and that will subside, and we will come together as always and deal with the reality that we face moving forward. Once again, we thank everyone for their thoughts and prayers. According to the Goncalves family's attorney, prosecutors had broached the idea of a plea with them just days earlier, and the family responded that it was a hard no from their perspective. So they were stunned when a letter arrived on June 30th confirming that a deal was in place despite their objections. Kaylee's younger sister, Aubrey, also shared a poignant statement condemning the agreement, pointing out that even with a life term, Bryan Kohberger would still be alive and able to interact with the world, whereas the victims will never have that chance. She wrote in part, quote, "Bryan Kohberger facing a life in prison means he would still get to speak, form relationships, and engage with the world. Meanwhile, our loved ones have been silenced forever." And she said that it essentially stings and that the system is protecting his future more than honoring the victim's past. The family has also formally requested that the hearing be postponed beyond July 2nd, so they actually have some time to get there and be present in the courtroom. Other victims' families have not all spoken publicly about the plea deal. The Goncalves family has probably been the most vocal throughout this whole process, and it is unclear if they unanimously oppose it. But prosecutors have stated that they met with available family members in advance of offering Bryan this plea deal, and that the family's input was weighed heavily in their decision-making. So this suggests that maybe there were some relatives that may have reluctantly agreed or understood the rationale for a plea, but nonetheless, the very public fury of the Goncalves family highlights a tension between what prosecutors believe is a just, expedited resolution and what some families feel is an unacceptable compromise on justice. So the next steps are that the plea agreement still requires approval by the judge, but legal experts note that judges rarely reject negotiated plea deals of this nature. So if and when the judge accepts the terms, Bryan Kohberger will formally be convicted on all counts and will face multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, one for each of the 4 murders. Sentencing would likely follow pretty soon after this hearing, and this would officially end the case without ever having a trial, meaning the full evidence will not be aired out in court and Bryan will not face a jury. But it also means that Bryan's punishment is final and he will spend the rest of his life behind bars without any chance of appeal. So for the victims' families and the public, this implication is that there will be no dramatic courtroom showdown. The outcome is essentially settled. And, you know, I speaking from the outside, obviously so removed, I don't have a dog in this fight at all. But when I initially heard this, I was like, at least there won't be pictures of the crime scene leaked. At least those graphic details, those graphic and traumatic details won't be aired out for everyone to see. Because I don't think that the families would want that of their children, essentially. So, you know, at first that was my thought, but when I then heard that their considerations weren't actually considered, I can see why they would be so heartbroken. This is just such a traumatic and abrupt end to such a long, tedious, exhausting, traumatic event. So I wonder if, as the dust settles, the Goncalves family will be able to find peace and closure after all of this, and it not have to get, reopened as the years go on without all those appeals. So I don't know. I can absolutely see both sides here, but I want to know what your thoughts are. If you're listening on Spotify, you can leave it in the comments of this episode. If you're listening on Apple, they don't have that kind of feature yet, but you can always let me know on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok. I'm on all of the platforms, Mama.Mystery Podcast. So let me know what your thoughts are. That is it for this breaking news update. Stay curious, stay vigilant. Have a great rest of your week. We'll see you for the weekly docket on Friday. That's all. Bye.